Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on a world that is bizarre, ambitious. We are diving headfirst into the world of medieval beauty standards. This was an era where the ultimate goal wasn't to look healthy, vibrant, or sun-kissed, but rather to look like someone who had just been politely and permanently excused from all forms of physical labor. So, before you get too comfortable, if you genuinely enjoy exploring the stranger corners of history with me, it truly helps the channel grow. And I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Assemble. Alright, dim the lights. Maybe get a fan going for that soft, ambient hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the medieval world. Looking deathly pale was under sign that you were burning the candle at both ends, or needed a vitamin D supplement. It was a silent, but incredibly loud, announcement to the world that screamed, I am far too wealthy and important to ever feel the sun on my skin. Unlike today, where a healthy glow might suggest a weekend trip to the coast, or a fondness for green smoothies, medieval beauty completely flipped that script. To them, tan skin meant one thing, and one thing only. You worked outside. And if you worked outside, you were poor. And if you were poor, you were engaged in gas manual labor. Nothing screamed unbeautiful in the 14th century, quite like looking as though. So, the paler you were, the higher your perceived status. And when we say pale, we're not talking about a soft, ivory complexion. We're talking about a level of paleness that was almost translucent, a porcelain finish with delicate vascular undertones. The ideal was skin so light, it looked like you had either been recently startled by a ghost, or perhaps you were a ghost. Of course, nature rarely cooperates, especially if you were born with a functioning circulatory system. So, people had to help it along. Noble women, and even some men, would turn to a rather potent cosmetic. It provided that signature corpse chic glow that was all the rage. And as an added bonus, it would slowly and systematically poison you from the outside in. But, as we all know, beauty has always demanded its price. For those not quite ready to commit to heavy metal poisoning, there were other options. Some would press vinegar-soaked cloths to their faces, hoping to bleach their skin into submission. Others created a luxurious, if not bizarre, facial mask from a mixture of crushed pearls and egg whites. This concoction not only promised to lighten the face, but also came with the delightful side effect of making one's cheeks feel like a stale, crusted omelette. To take the illusion of fragility even further, delicate blue veins were sometimes painted onto the arms, chest, and neck, because nothing says, I am a precious. Even the literature of the time was obsessed with this aesthetic. Romantic poems would describe their heroines as pale as milk, white as snow, and in one particularly evocative instance, as the moon in winter, which is a very poetic way of saying she looks like she might faint at any moment. And honestly, I love it. It was a powerful, non-verbal shorthand for class, for purity, and for a complete and total economic disengagement from the dirt and toil of agriculture. If you could afford to look that fragile, you were winning the game. But for those striving to achieve that prestigious, deathly pale complexion, a simple lack of sun wasn't enough. No, achieving true medieval beauty required commitment. And by commitment, we mean a slow, decorative form of chemical warfare, waged upon yourself. They reached for makeup, specifically a lead-based, as in the same toxic substance we now pay professionals to seal away in old buildings. But back then, it was considered the absolute cutting edge of cosmetic technology. The result of applying this powder was a smooth, pale, matte finished medieval equivalent of a high-definition chêne. It made the skin appear flawless, porcelain-like, and, eventually, feel very, very not flawless. This white lead powder was created by taking lead metal, exposing it to vinegar. This crust was then scraped off and ground into a fine powder. Apply that to your face daily. You looked like a luminous, delicate aristocrat with a secret death wish. And if your skin began to flake, blister, or fall off in small diplomatic chunks, even better. That just meant the makeup was working, probably, and this wasn't a one-product routine. Many would add a touch of mercury-based rouge for a hint of color, or perhaps some chalk dust to help the lead powder stay on longer. Egg whites were often brushed over the entire face to create a smooth, glazed look. Basically, if it came from a barn, a mine, or an alchemist's shelf, you can bet someone in the Middle Ages had rubbed it on their face in the name of elegance. The downside, beyond the obvious slow poisoning, was that lead-based products caused a horrifying list of ailments, chronic fatigue, skin ulcers, and even premature death side effects you won't find listed on most modern skincare labels. Yet, because if the choice was between dying slowly and being mistaken for a peasant, the nobility often chose the scenic route to the grave. And men weren't always immune to these trends, either. Some male courtiers, especially in the later medieval and early Renaissance courts, where image was everything, would also use powders and skin treatments. It was all part of the game of looking just as refined as your lineage, or at least smelling slightly less terrible than your rival courtier. But of all the medieval beauty trends we could possibly discuss, the obsession with high foreheads, well, eyebrow raising. Literally, because people were actively removing their eyebrows to achieve it. In this era, a tall, smooth, uninterrupted forehead, it was considered a sign of elegance, intelligence, and even divinity. It was the architectural marvel of the medieval face. The ideal forehead basically said, I spend my days reading psalms and looking pensively out of castle windows. To achieve this noble, dome-like look, women went to some extreme. They were plucked into oblivion. And sometimes, even the scalp hair was removed, inch by painful inch. Medieval grooming manuals, which were a real thing, advised women to use tweezers. These creams were made from a horrifying cocktail of ingredients, like cat dung, quicklime, or vinegar-soaked leechazole, in the name of showcasing a forehead that could practically double as a sundial. If you look at portraits from the time, you'll see women with these serene, placid expressions and foreheads so vast you could probably host a small joust on them. When you combined this high-dom aesthetic with a deathly pale skin and soft facial features, it became the undisputed shorthand for refined beauty. And it wasn't just about the face. Fashion was designed to support this look. Tight-fitting hoods, wimples that wrapped around the chin and neck, and of course the famous cone-shaped hats called hennins. All of these helped to pull the hairline up, or, at the very least, hide the parts. From England to France to Italy, noble women leaned hard into the high-forward style, and poets reinforced it by praising women whose faces seemed to begin somewhere near the crown of their head. Of course, not everyone had the time, money, or pain tolerance, so, in a moment of pure medieval ingenuity, some women would fake it. They'd draw their new, higher forehead line on, and then cover the rest of their natural hair. The Middle Ages had its own version of contouring. It just involved a lot more fabric and a lot less blending. In medieval Europe, eyebrows weren't just underappreciated. They were actively eliminated. While modern trends might celebrate bold brows, feathered arches, and a million TikTok tutorials on how to achieve them. In the 14th and 15th centuries, eyebrows were seen as little more than unnecessary facial clutter. To get the ideal look, women plucked their eyebrows into near non-existence. Or, why? Because that bare, smooth forehead was the pinnacle of elegance. Eyebrows were basically considered stubborn weeds. In the pristine garden of the face, some women went even further, shaving the brow area completely to ensure that not a single rebellious strand interfered with their alabaster. It's the kind of commitment that would make a modern beauty influencer blink twice, mostly because there were no brow pencils to draw them back in later. To remove the brows, medieval women used the classic tweezers and wax, but also pumice stones, or, because nothing says, "I'm dedicated to my look," quite like this was far more than just a passing fad. Art from the period, from illuminated manuscripts to formal oil portraits, noble women are frequently depicted with these smooth, expansive foreheads and eerily expressionless eyes. The result is either serene and angelic or slightly alien. Interestingly, the no-brow trend wasn't entirely uniform across all of Europe. In some regions, thin or lightly arched brows did persist, especially as influences from the Middle East and the Byzantine Empire filtered in through trade and war. But by and large, the message from the fashion capitals of the time was clear. If people can see your eyebrows, you're doing it wrong. And this wasn't just a trend for women. Men, especially those in the orbit of court life, would occasionally trim or groom their brows as part of a larger aesthetic of refinement. Though, it's worth noting, full removal was rare among males unless, of course, They had lost them in a particularly heated theological debate. What all of this tells us is that medieval beauty ideals weren't about looking natural. They were about looking curated, symbolic, and just a little bit angelic. After all, if you look at medieval art, angels rarely have eyebrows. Possibly, but it certainly worked for them. In the Middle Ages, having a touch of color in your cheeks was desirable. But like most things in medieval life, it came with a labyrinth of rules, social risks, and a vague. The ideal was a subtle, delicate blush, the kind you might get from hearing a mildly scandalous poem or stepping outdoors. Lest you risk getting a tan. Heaven forbid. A gentle, rosy hue on the cheeks suggested youth, and general good health, all things that were considered attractive, particularly if you could maintain them past the ripe old age of 28. But here was the catch. You could look. Applying rouge or any kind of artificial color was considered vain, and vanity was suspiciously close to sin. The church was not amused by women smearing color on their face, which is a theological gray area that scholars are probably still trying to define. Still, women improvised. Common blush ingredients included things you might find in a garden or kitchen. Beetroot juice, crushed strawberries, or mulberries. Some even used cochineal, a deep red pigment made from crushed insects. Yes, because beauty has never been for the faint of heart. Some women would simply rub their cheeks vigorously to get that natural flush, while others used mixtures of red ochre, dabbed on carefully to avoid detection by both the local clergy and your judgmental neighbors. For the truly wealthy, rouge could be made from red lead or cinnabar, both. But the logic seemed to be something along the lines of, I may die young. Rouge was typically applied with a cloth, one's fingers, or whatever tool was available that hadn't just been used to season a stew. Access to mirrors was limited, so many women relied on instinct. Of course, if your blush was too visible, you risked being accused of imitating prostitutes, or even worse, French courtiers. The goal was always modest enhancement, not a theatrical statement. If someone complimented your healthy glow, you were expected to deny everything and mutter something about the wind being particularly brisk that day. Even nuns, it is said, would occasionally wear a touch of rouge discreetly, because nothing says I serve the Lord like a tasteful dab of beetroot behind the cloister walls. In medieval Europe, if your hair didn't look like it had been kissed by holy light or stolen from a bottled angel, blonde hair, in particular, was the medieval gold standard. It was associated with youth, beauty, virtue, and in case you needed a divine backup, the Virgin Mary was frequently painted as a blonde. This was despite the fact that, geographically speaking, she almost certainly was not. But realism was far less important than radiance. If you were born blonde, you were considered blessed and probably got out of a few chores. But natural blondness often doesn't last, especially in a world without modern hair care. So, medieval women took matters into their own hands. Homemade hair lightening concoctions included a fascinating blend of ingredients like saffron, chamomile, ash. This mixture would be applied liberally and then left to bake under the sun. It worked best if you had the patience of a saint and the skin of a salamander. Some recipes also included a rather startling ingredient: urine. It was thought to help lift color. Whose urine? That part was less regulated, but as long as it gave your hair that celestial shimmer, beauty is, and always has been, a little bit disgusting. Hair texture mattered, too. Loose, long, wavy locks were the ideal. Once you were married, your golden mane was to be hidden away under a complex system of veils, nets, because apparently, the moment you said "I do," your hair became a national security risk. For noble women, hair was often braided, twisted, or tucked into elaborate styles, especially when attending court or religious events. These hairstyles were frequently accessorized with silk ribbons, beads, or embroidery, just in case you needed to remind everyone in the room that you didn't shear sheep for a living. And men weren't entirely left out of this either. While not judged quite as harshly, men with thick, golden locks were often romanticized in poetry and art. Charging into battle was the medieval equivalent of a shampoo commercial. In medieval Europe, hair was a lot like money. If you had it, you didn't necessarily show it off in public, unless, of course, you were trying to get married. Then, suddenly, it became a strategic asset. Unmarried women were often encouraged to wear their hair long and loose as a symbol of their purity and innocence, though not too loose, unless you were going for that ethereal, forest maiden look, which was only socially acceptable if you were, say, an actual saint, or in the process of being martyred. Otherwise, a gentle braid would suffice. But the moment a woman was married, her hair was immediately banished from public view. Congratulations, you now had a husband and a solemn obligation to wrap your locks up tighter than a monastery's wine budget. This introduced the world to an entire wardrobe of head coverings, veils, wimples, nets, and coifs. It was a medieval closet of modesty that could make even the most radiant blonde disappear under 3 layers of beige linen. These coverings weren't just about being modest. They were also incredibly practical. They protected hair from the smoke of open fires, from lice a constant threat, and from the unsolicited compliments of passing troubadours. The most dedicated women would layer their coverings. A coif, which was a close-fitting cap, might be worn under a veil. That veil could then be pinned beneath a wimple, a cloth that wrapped under the chin and around the neck. The final effect, you looked like a pious, well-bundled sandwich, and that was precisely the goal. But fashion is rarely satisfied with just function. As time went on, headwear became more and more elaborate. Nets were embroidered with gold thread. Veils were starched into stiff, geometric shapes. Some noble women wore what were essentially silken cages for their braids, accessorized with jewels and even tiny bells. Because nothing says subtle beauty like jingling every time you turn your head. In many cultures of the time, concealed hair was directly tied to a woman's morality. A covered head was seen as a sign of being modest and virtuous. Exposed hair on a married woman, however, could get you compared to a lady of the night, or even worse, a French woman. Of course, some women found ways to rebel. They might let a little curl strategically slip out or wear translucent veils. That technically counted as being covered, while still letting the world admire their carefully dyed strands. Medieval loopholes were alive and well. If medieval beauty had one unspoken rule, it was this: taller is nobler, and we're not talking about your legs. By the 15th century, women across Europe, particularly in the wealthy courts of France and Burgundy, began embracing a fashion trend that quite literally elevated their appearance. I'm talking about the hennin. You know, the one, those towering cone-shaped hats that look like they were designed by someone who spent a little too much time around church steeples. The hennin wasn't just head. It was a social ladder you wore on your head. These hats could reach upwards of 2 feet, sometimes even more. The taller the hennin, the higher your status and the more doorways you smacked into on your way to dinner. Often made from fine silk, velvet, or brocade. Hennins were structured with wireframes, which gave them that dangerously aerodynamic shape. A sheer veil would usually cascade from the tip, adding a sense of movement, mystery, and a very good chance of getting caught. In a candle now, getting your hair to fit under one of these contraptions was an art in itself. Hair was typically braided and stuffed up into the cone. And remember that forehead real estate we talked about? It was still very much a thing. The hair around the forehead was often shaved to help the hennin sit properly. Comfort was not part of the design brief, but hennins weren't the only vertical obsession. Some women wore heart-shaped escoffions, which looked like 2 croissants glued to either side of the head. Others wore butterfly hennins, where the veils were spread out on a wire frame like wings. These were great for drama, not so much for reign, outside of the nobility. Most women stuck with simpler veils, linen caps, or circlets. They were simpler, less dangerous, and far less likely to be mistaken for a siege weapon. The clergy and other conservative thinkers, as you can imagine, were less than in. They warned that such ostentatious displays invited vanity, sin, and possibly some serious neck strain. Still, hennins remained wildly popular among those who could afford them, much like most terrible but fashionable ideas throughout history. And while men didn't wear towering cones, they had their own style statements to make. Think feathered caps, fur-trimmed hoods, and pointy shoes that were so long they could double as fencing equipment. In medieval times, a woman's ideal body wasn't meant to be athletic, curvy, or toned. No, the goal was to appear delicate, demure, and possibly as if you were perpetually recovering from a fainting spell. The ideal figure was slim, soft, and slightly ethereal, like someone who subsisted entirely on honey water, courtly poems, and perhaps 1 fig a week. Beauty manuals of the era didn't advise women to build strength or endurance. The only lifting you were expected to do was lifting your veil in a flirtatious gesture before swiftly looking away and, just maybe, swooning a little. But this wasn't about looking sickly, at least not obviously. The sweet spot was somewhere between being too weak to carry a bucket of water and still being able to play the lute while sitting gracefully. A willowy, graceful figure was associated with nobility because, of course, if you were actually working for a living, you'd have broader shoulders, stronger arms, and the general misfortune of muscle tone. The emphasis was on a narrow waist, soft curves, and a general air of spiritual exhaustion. Waistlines on dresses were often singed just below the bust. An early version of the empire waist which served to elongate the torso and give the illusion of height and fragility. And if that illusion needed a little help, tight lacing was available. We're not talking about full-blown corsets. Just yet, those came later, but tightly bound kirtles and girdles did the job just fine. However, being too thin wasn't the goal either. In times of frequent famine and plague, being excessively thin was a major red flag. It suggested that person might be actively dying, so a small hint of roundness, particularly in the face or hips, was considered a sign of health and fertility. Basically, if you looked like you could survive the winter and still be poetic about it, you were in the sweet spot. Diet advice from the time wasn't exactly balanced. Beauty manuals recommended things like eating fennel for digestion, chewing on rose petals for fresh breath, and drinking plenty of wine to improve one's complexion. Protein was fine, but only if it still had a feather attached. Men, on the other hand, were allowed to have a bit more substance. Broad shoulders, strong legs, and the ability to carry a sword without toppling over were all desirable traits. But even then, the nobility preferred a lean, refined frame, not brute strength, in the Middle Ages. A woman's eyes were her silent power. They were the medieval version of sending a flirty emoji, only with far more spiritual implications and slightly less blinking. The ideal medieval eyes were large, clear, and soulful, the kind of eyes that seemed to whisper, "I'm full of virtue and maybe just a hint of melancholy." Think of eyes that looked as if they had personally witnessed the fall of man and were still politely recovering. Poets of the period couldn't get enough of them. They described eyes as luminous orbs, dewdrops of heaven, or pools of pure devotion. What they rarely, if ever, described them as was bloodshot, allergy-ridden, or I was up all night churning butter. Light-colored eyes, particularly blue or grey, were often idealized in Northern Europe. They were associated with innocence, purity, and the general assumption that you hadn't seen too many disturbing things in your life, or at least, you were good at pretending you hadn't. In Southern Europe, darker eyes were admired as well, especially if they came paired with a noble lineage and a good dowry. Enhancing the eyes was a challenging endeavor. There were no medieval eyeliner pens, just a bit of charcoal, soot, and a whole lot of optimism. Some women would dab a little black powder around their lashes to make their eyes look bigger, a practice that risked irritation, blurry vision, or starting the world's first accidental smoky eye. But for the most part, women relied on nature and strategic lighting. Want to look more wide-eyed, stand near a candle. Want to look more virtuous, look downward at all times, even if it means tripping over the cat. Interestingly, slightly teary eyes were sometimes admired. It suggested emotional sensitivity, piety, and perhaps that you had just finished praying or reading something incredibly uplifting, like a 300-line poem about chastity. Artificial tears weren't available, but staring directly into smoke or enduring. Mild public humiliation usually did the trick. As for eye contact, it was a delicate dance. Too much could be seen as bold, flirtatious, or suspiciously French. Too little, and you risked seeming shifty or possibly possessed. The trick was to occasionally glance up from beneath lowered lids, like someone who had memorized the entire Bible but wasn't about to brag about it. Let's talk about something that is rarely mentioned in medieval love poetry: breath, specifically what it smelled like. While a knight might wax lyrical about his lady's rosebud lips or her pearl-like teeth, he usually skipped over what happened when those lips actually opened. That's because medieval dental hygiene was, at best, an aspirational concept. Minty freshness hadn't been invented yet, unless you count standing near a herb garden and hoping for the best. Still, having fresh breath was technically considered desirable. A gentle, sweet-smelling mouth hinted at youth, health, and the fact that you probably hadn't eaten garlic and eels for breakfast even, though statistically you probably had. Medieval women did what they could with what they had. They would chew on parsley, fennel seeds, cloves, or cinnamon sticks. Sometimes they even chewed on actual twigs. This wasn't just for the taste, it was to keep the mouth tolerable. Think of it as the pre-mint version of chewing gum. It didn't exactly sparkle your teeth, but it made you slightly more kissable, or at least less terrifying in close conversation, for those with access to an apothecary. There were also herbal pastes and mouth rinses made from ingredients like sage, vinegar, and myrrh. These were applied sparingly, both because they were expensive and because opening your mouth too wide in public was considered a bit much. Toothbrushing, as we know it, wasn't standard practice. Instead, people would wipe their teeth with a clean cloth, rub them with chalk or crushed herbs, or use chew sticks. These were small, fibrous twigs that could be used to scrub the teeth and also double as something to fidget with while your suitor recited bad poetry. And while halitosis wasn't exactly romantic, it wasn't considered shocking either. After all, everyone had bad breath to some degree, and they all had much bigger problems to worry about, like surviving the winter or avoiding being burned as a heretic. For noble women, the trick was to minimize offense while maintaining an air of grace. Conversations often took place at arm's length. Public affection was limited, and when in doubt, you could always fan yourself and look contemplative. Bonus points if you carried a small pomander, which was a scented orb filled with herbs that you could wave gently in your own direction as needed. In modern times, a great smile can launch 1,000 dating apps. In the Middle Ages, a smile was a risky endeavor, best used sparingly, like spices or peasant revolts. Why? Well, as we've touched upon, medieval dental hygiene wasn't exactly flourishing. Teeth were important, yes, but more for the practical purpose of chewing bread than for charming suitors. Most people had teeth that ranged from slightly questionable to actively terrifying, especially by the time they reached age 30. So, the fewer people who saw them, the better. This wasn't entirely due to negligence. Tooth decay was rampant, thanks to diets heavy in bread, porridge, and mead, and severely lacking in toothbrushes, dental floss, or literally any kind of fluoride. Sugar wasn't widely consumed yet in most of Europe, but even basic starches would break down into tooth-tarnishing misery. Also, dental surgery at the time was essentially an exorcism with pliers. Despite all this, a healthy smile was quietly admired, just not loudly celebrated. White, even teeth were incredibly rare and seen as a mark of youth, good fortune, and perhaps a small miracle. But people weren't going around flashing big, toothy grins like they were in a medieval toothpaste commercial. In fact, a demure, closed-lipped smile was far more fashionable. Think I might be contemplating a sonnet rather than I'm thrilled to be here. Some women did use powders made from sage, salt, or even ground-up coral to try and clean or whiten their teeth. These methods were only mildly effective and mostly just abrasive. Imagine brushing your teeth with sand and hoping for the best. But overall, teeth were tolerated, not flaunted. Medieval art, for instance, almost never depicts open-mouthed smiles. Even saints and angels in paintings usually keep their mouths politely closed, as if they, too, were quietly aware of the risks of showing their molars. And men weren't immune to this, either. A knight might win the heart of a lady with his bravery and his chiseled jawline, but no ballad ever included the line, "His bicuspids gleamed like ivory." There's a reason troubadours sang about eyes, hair, and hands, not breath and bite alignment. When it came to medieval beauty standards for men, the expectations were oddly specific. You didn't need to be chiseled like a Greek statue, but you also couldn't look like you'd just fallen off a hay cart. The sweet spot was somewhere between, ready to joust, and could write a poem about jousting without actually having to do it. The ideal man was tall, lean, and broad-shouldered, but most importantly, he had to look nobly unbothered. He wasn't supposed to be overly muscular, that suggested manual labor, but he couldn't be soft either, as that suggested laziness, or perhaps a bit too much mead. You wanted to look like you could swing a sword, but only if the squire was busy. A defined jawline, high cheekbones, and a straight nose were all considered attractive features. Think of the princes you see in illuminated manuscripts, rather than the village strongman. A well-groomed beard or a smooth, clean-shaven face were both acceptable, depending on the region and the specific era. But either way, it needed to look intentional, not like you'd just been lost in the woods for a week. Hair was typically worn, shoulder-length and styled, especially for noblemen. Curls were very much in fashion in many courts, especially if they occurred naturally, or at least looked like they did. Some men even used curling irons. Yes, really. They would use small, heated rods or herbal rinses to enhance texture and shine, because nothing says I'm above manual labor, like sitting for 45 minutes while your page boy styles your fringe. Clothing played a huge role in enhancing the ideal male silhouette. Padded shoulders, cinched waists, and fitted tunics all helped to create the desired body shape, with an extra emphasis on posture. A nobleman did not slouch. He glided, often with a subtle hint of disdain. And if a man did happen to be naturally muscular, that was fine, as long as he wasn't caught actually working with those muscles. Fighting in wars was acceptable. Hauling barrels was not. Above all, the look was meant to be effortless. You weren't supposed to try to be attractive. You were simply born noble, and that alone was supposed to make you appealing. It was a kind of medieval version of hot without trying. Except instead of a gym membership, you inherited land and a falcon. In an era where bathing was technically optional and plumbing was mostly just a dream with a Latin name, scent management became a true art form. And we're not talking about the glamorous walk-through-a-cloud-of-Chanel-no-5 kind of art. It was more of the mask it and pray variety. To be fair, people did bathe, just not as often as we might hope, especially depending on the century, their location, and the current frequency of the plague. So, to keep from offending nostrils, both human and divine medieval men and women turned to the olfactory power of herbs, oils, and perfume pouches. Let's begin with the pomander. This was a small, hollow ball, usually made of metal, that was worn on a chain or pinned to clothing. It was filled with strongly scented herbs like cloves, rosemary, cinnamon, sage, and occasionally something ominously labeled powder of roses. These weren't just for elegance. They were portable smell shields. Think of them as the medieval version of walking around with a Febreze grenade. The nobility also favored perfumed gloves, handkerchiefs, and even scented combs. Everything was fair game for aroma enhancement, including hair, which was sometimes doused with floral waters or vinegar infusions that, presumably, smelled slightly better than sweat and desperation. Speaking of sweat, yes, people absolutely sweated. Medieval garments were heavy, summers were hot, and deodorant was still several centuries away from reinventing the armpit. The solution was layers of linen, which absorbed sweat and could be washed more frequently than the woolen or silk outer garments. Some people would add herbal sachets to their underlayers, hoping to combat odor with a bit of fragrant optimism. Bathhouses were a thing, especially during the early and late medieval periods, but access to them varied wildly. The church eventually began to frown upon communal nudity, which really put a damper on public hygiene enthusiasm. So, many people turned to dry bathing, which is exactly as unrefreshing as it sounds. It involved wiping yourself down with a cloth, spritzing on some scented water, and pretending that counted. And then there were the overachievers, the people who kept flower petals in their shoes or stuffed herbs in their bed linens, all in an effort to smell vaguely like someone who had recently seen a garden. In medieval Europe, beauty wasn't just skin deep, it was morally loaded. A well-composed face could be a divine blessing, a social weapon, or a trap set by the devil himself, sometimes all three before breakfast. To be beautiful was to walk a very, very fine line. On the one hand, physical beauty, clear skin, symmetrical features, a pale complexion was often considered a sign of virtue. If you were lovely, it was seen as a sign that you were blessed, possibly even chosen by God, or, at the very least, unlikely to steal sheep. Poets, preachers, and painters alike described beauty as the outward evidence of a pure soul. But there was a catch. If you knew you were beautiful, or worse, if you used that beauty to your advantage, you immediately became suspect. Vanity was a sin, remember, and showing too much interest in one's own appearance hinted at pride, seduction, or worst of all French tendencies. Medieval sermons constantly warned that women's beauty could tempt men into sin, which, of course, was considered entirely the woman's fault. Eve had set a precedent, and medieval Europe ran with it for a solid 1,000 years. A woman wearing makeup, showing a bit of hair, or fluttering her lashes at the wrong night could easily find herself accused of being everything from immoral to outright demonic. Some even believed that beauty could be an illusion, a sorceress's disguise, a glamour conjured by witches to lead righteous men astray. This may sound overly dramatic, but remember, this was a time when bad weather could get you burned at the stake. Conversely, those who were plain or ill-featured were sometimes assumed to be morally deficient or simply unfortunate. The idea that one's outward appearance reflected their inner character wasn't just a popular notion. It was practically doctrine in some circles. Beauty meant grace. Ugliness could imply punishment, illness, or divine disappointment. Of course, all of this made things spectacularly confusing. You were supposed to be beautiful, but not try too hard. You should glow with virtue, but not so much that it looks like pride. And above all, you should never, ever look more attractive than the local lord's wife. That was a one-way ticket to a silent convent or an unusually convenient illness. So, in the end, medieval beauty standards weren't just about aesthetics. They were a full-blown moral tightrope, a constant balancing act between vanity and virtue, with whatever powdered lead was left in your makeup kit tipping the scales. Now, let's shift gears and travel back to ancient Persia, to a force so legendary. They were said to be untouchable. The Persian immortals were more than just elite troops. They were a statement. They were a living, breathing symbol of imperial strength, precision, and unyielding continuity. Their origins trace back to the very birth of the Achaemenid Empire under Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BCE, at a time when Persia was rapidly transforming from a regional power into a sprawling imperial juggernaut. Cyrus understood something vital. An empire needs a backbone. It needs not just administrators and governors, but an elite force that can project dominance, inspire loyalty, and suppress rebellion with equal, terrifying efficiency. Thus, the Immortals were born. The name Immortals wasn't just a bit of royal flair, it was a logistical and psychological masterpiece. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, their strength was always kept at exactly 10,000 men. If one man died, fell ill, or was wounded in battle, he was instantly replaced. The numbers never wavered. From the outside, it seemed as though they could not be diminished, could not be weakened, and above all, could not die. Whether this was a myth or just very clever bookkeeping, the image stuck and the name endured. Immortality, in this case, wasn't about individual survival. It was about the eternal, unchanging presence of Persian might. These men weren't random conscripts. To be an immortal meant being selected from among the Persian nobility, or, at the very least, from families of high status and proven loyalty. Their training began young. Discipline was brutal. Loyalty to the king was unquestionable. They were expected to be not just warriors, but exemplars of Achaemenid values, order, obedience, and composure under pressure. They were also richly dressed, wearing robes of fine materials, with scale armor beneath their garments. They were typically armed with a spear, a bow, a short sword, and a wicker shield. Their appearance was as calculated as their tactics, Persian. Kings weren't just sending warriors into battle. They were sending a mobile political message wrapped in silk and steel. From the plains of Lydia to the deserts of Egypt, wherever the Persian Empire expanded, the Immortals followed. They stood behind kings, beside thrones, and at the very front of the battlefield. If you saw them approaching, you didn't just see soldiers, you saw the unbroken heartbeat of the empire. Immortals didn't blink. Immortals didn't retreat. Immortals endured. And that's exactly what made them so terrifying. The appearance of the Persian Immortals was no accident. It was a carefully crafted piece of psychological warfare. These men weren't covered head to toe in gleaming bronze like the Greek hoplites. No, the Immortals looked almost otherworldly, like a wave of richly dressed shadows sweeping across the land. Their uniforms blended regal flair with military function. They wore elaborately embroidered tunics and trousers, often dyed in the rich reds and purples that signified nobility and command. Beneath these fine garments lay a layer of scale armor made of bronze or iron, which was flexible enough for movement but deadly effective in close combat. Their shields were made from woven wicker, making them deceptively light, yet strong enough to deflect arrows and absorb the shock of a blow. Their most distinctive element, however, was their headdress, a soft felt cap called a tiara, which was sometimes pulled over the face to obscure their individual identity. Unlike the Greeks, who glorified individuality in their armor and their pursuit of personal valor, the Immortals thrived on uniformity. 10,000 men moving in near silence, all similarly armed and armored, created a visual spectacle that was designed to overwhelm the senses. It was like watching a curtain of death descend upon the battlefield. Each Immortal carried a short spear, a bow with a quiver full of arrows, and a short sword, or achenex, at their belt. But perhaps their most impressive skill was their ability to move quickly and remain deadly in almost any terrain. Their training emphasized agility and endurance over brute strength. They could march across entire provinces without breaking formation, and unlike many ancient forces, the immortals were equally comfortable fighting in an open battle or serving as the imperial guard in the opulent royal courts. Their equipment was light enough to ensure swift deployment, but potent enough to intimidate and destroy. It wasn't about brute force. It was about consistency. It was about never failing, never staggering, and never seeming vulnerable. And that consistency, combined with the mystery of their appearance, helped to forge their legend. When they marched into battle, drums would pound and dust would rise behind them, but their expressions, it was said, remained eerily composed. There was no roaring, no boasting, just an eerie, synchronized precision. It was as though they were not men at all, but machines, crafted not from flesh and blood, but from discipline, ritual, and fear. To face the immortals wasn't simply to face death. It was to face a concept that some armies didn't just fight. They endured without pause or pity. To be an immortal was not just a job. It was a lifelong identity, a status symbol, and in some ways, a sentence. While they were revered and richly rewarded, the expectations placed upon them were immense. These men lived under constant scrutiny. Their food, their clothing, and their housing were all provided by the state. But this wasn't out of kindness. It was to ensure absolute control. From the moment they entered the ranks, they belonged not to their families, but to the empire. Most immortals came from Persian, Median, or Elamite nobility, but the sons of lower-ranking but loyal families could rise into the ranks if they showed exceptional discipline. Training began in childhood, often within military academies attached to the royal court. Boys learned archery on horseback, how to endure pain and hunger, how to march in perfect step, and most importantly, how to obey without a moment's hesitation. There was no room for glory-seeking or personal ambition. An immortal who stood out too much was corrected. The formation was sacred. Unity came above all else. Discipline ruled every corner of their lives. They followed a strict daily routine. Wake before dawn, drill in silence, maintain their weapons and armor. Meals were eaten communally, and they were always modest, nutritionally. Calculated for endurance, meat, flatbread dates, and wine were staples, but luxuries were discouraged. The empire needed hardened warriors, not pampered aristocrats. When not on campaign, the immortals served as the personal guards for the king and his court. But even then, their duties were more than just ceremonial. They stood watch for assassination attempts, they monitored nobles for any signs of disloyalty, and they maintained order in the most volatile places of the empire. Their mere presence could silence dissent in a royal hall. They were the eyes and ears of the Achaemenid ruler, trained to detect lies, sense fear, and act decisively. Interestingly, they weren't entirely cut off from family life. Immortals were allowed to marry and maintain households. However, they could be summoned at a moment's notice. When duty called, they left everything behind, no questions asked. A man who hesitated, even once, could be quietly replaced. After all, the number always had to remain at 10,000. No gaps, no delays. It was this cold, efficient system that ensured their mythos. They didn't just fight with discipline, they lived in it. They were tools of the empire, honed, polished, and sharpened until nothing remained but duty. If Cyrus the Great created the immortals, it was Darius the Great who perfected them. When Darius rose to power in 522 BCE, amidst a storm of palace intrigue and assassination, The immortals were the tool he used to legitimize and stabilize his reign. Under him, they were no longer just a personal guard. They became an extension of royal authority, woven directly into the fabric of his expanding imperial bureaucracy. Darius understood that power didn't just rest on military strength, but on the illusion of order and inevitability, and nothing projected that image more effectively than the immortals. He paraded them at festivals, had them stationed prominently around his magnificent new capital of Persepolis, and sent them on high-profile missions. They were always visible, always composed, and always the same, 10,000, eternal faces of Persian dominance. But Darius also reshaped their tactical role. Under his leadership, the immortals became a core element of Persian combined arms warfare. No longer just elite infantry, they were often deployed alongside archers, cavalry, and chariotry in carefully coordinated strikes. Darius placed immense value on strategic flexibility, and the immortals had to adapt. They trained more rigorously in ranged combat, siege warfare, and battlefield coordination. Reports from later Greek observers describe how they moved with terrifying efficiency, firing arrows in volleys while slowly advancing behind their wicker shields, never breaking formation. They also became heavily involved in suppressing rebellions. Darius's empire stretched from Egypt to the Indus Valley, and revolts were a frequent problem. The immortals were often the first wave of retaliation sent to places like Elam, Babylon, and Ionia. They acted as both a punishment and a message. The empire is watching, and the king's will is inexhaustible. It was under Darius that they earned a darker reputation, not just as elite warriors, but as instruments of fear and retribution. Even their iconography was elevated. The famous carvings at Persepolis show them in perfect, repeating lines, stylized, and identical, facing eternity in stone. These weren't mere portraits, they were propaganda. Darius wanted every subject and every foreign visitor to know, these men are always here. They are always armed, and they do not die. Step out of line, and you'll meet one of them, or 10,000 of them. Through Darius, the immortals became more than a military unit. They were institutionalized fear, woven into the royal image, deployed with surgical precision, and wrapped in gold-threaded silence. The Persian immortals reached the absolute height of their legend during the reign of Xerxes the Great, and nowhere was their reputation more fiercely tested than at the narrow mountain pass of Thermopylae in 480 BCE. This battle, now mythologized through centuries of art and cinema, wasn't just a clash of armies. It was a symbolic collision between two radically different worldviews, the Persian ideal of imperial order versus the Greek concept of city-state defiance. And at the center of that storm stood the immortals. When Xerxes invaded Greece with what ancient sources claimed was the largest army the world had ever seen, he brought the immortals as his personal vanguard. They didn't just guard him. They were his scalpel, meant to be used in the heart of the chaos. Their reputation alone preceded them. The Greeks had heard the stories of the 10,000 who never died, the elite troops who served their kings like gods, and fought with flawless, terrifying precision. At Thermopylae, they met a resistance that rattled their mythos. King Leonidas and his few thousand Greeks, most famously the 300 Spartans, held the narrow pass against wave after wave of Persian attacks. On the second day of the battle, Xerxes ordered the immortals to break the Greek line. It was meant to be a crushing, decisive blow. After all, these were the elite of the elite. But what followed was not the instant rout that Xerxes had expected. The immortals, as skilled as they were constrained by the tight geography of the pass. Their bows were nearly useless in such a confined space, and their shorter spears couldn't reach past the long dory spears of the Greek hoplites. For hours they clashed with the disciplined Spartans, who fought in their tight, interlocking phalanx formation, trained from childhood for exactly this kind of brutal, close-quarters combat. The immortals suffered losses, heavy ones. Herodotus noted, perhaps with some glee, that they were no more successful than the ordinary troops had been. This wasn't just a military setback. It was a rupture in their carefully constructed image. The immortals had always appeared untouchable, like gods of war dressed in silk and scale armor. But at Thermopylae they bled, they died, and for the first time the illusion of their immortality cracked under the weight of Spartan spears and Greek defiance. Yet, even in defeat, they remained terrifying. They adapted, they regrouped, and they marched again. Immortality, after all, wasn't about invincibility, it was about endurance. The most fascinating part of the Persian immortals wasn't just their training or their battlefield tactics. It was their system. What truly made them immortal wasn't magic or divine favor. It was administration. It was cold, efficient, relentless. Bureaucracy, when one immortal fell, whether in battle, due to illness, or by retirement, another took his place instantly. There was no mourning, no ceremony, just a seamless substitution. The total number always remained at exactly 10,000. This wasn't a poetic exaggeration. It was policy, by design. The Achaemenid Empire ran on logistics, and the immortals were the prime example of this. They had a constantly maintained pool of trainees and understudies, young men who were being groomed to fill vacancies the moment they appeared. These replacements were kept in the capital, supervised, drilled, and rotated through lesser duties until they were called up. This internal structure made the immortals far more than just a static elite unit. They were a living system of excellence, always regenerating, always evolving. To facilitate this, records were kept with meticulous care. Officers known as Hazaropatus, which literally means commander of 1,000, oversaw recruitment, discipline, and supply. There were 10 such commanders, each responsible for a contingent, all under the overall leader of the immortals. Below them, a web of sub-commanders, scribes, and quartermasters ensured that every single man had the correct arms, rations, lodging, and medical support. If you lost a man in Egypt, a replacement was dispatched from Susa. If a soldier broke his leg during a patrol in Media, his successor was already packing his gear. This machinery extended beyond just military readiness. It was psychological. The illusion of 10,000 unchanging, eternal warriors was a powerful tool of imperial terror. If you killed one, another immediately stepped into his place. It didn't matter who they were individually. Their personal identity was irrelevant. The presence was what was eternal, like a hydra of discipline and silk. The immortals created the illusion of an unstoppable force because the machine that powered them never paused to grieve, even off the battlefield. This system functioned flawlessly. If an immortal's family became disloyal or politically compromised, he was quietly removed and replaced. There was no scandal, no drama. The line simply moved forward as if nothing had happened. This mechanism, so alien compared to the glory-seeking ethos of the Greeks, was perhaps the immortals' greatest strength. It wasn't skill, it wasn't courage, but the cold, hard certainty that they could never truly disappear. While the Persian immortals are remembered primarily as warriors, They were also something far more subtle. They were diplomats in armor. In the Achaemenid worldview, military force wasn't just about conquest, it was about presence. And the immortals were often deployed not just to fight, but to be seen. They would enter foreign courts as living, breathing representations of Persian elegance and power. Their silken robes, their gilded weapons, and their perfect, silent discipline made them terrifying in battle, but utterly mesmerizing in peace. Imagine a small, elite escort entering a Greek or Babylonian city. 10 men moving in perfect synchronicity, dressed not in rough leather or blood-stained bronze, but in fine tunics laced with gold, their faces silent and unreadable behind their soft felt headdresses. They didn't shout or threaten, they didn't need to. Their very existence was a negotiation in the satrapies or provinces. Immortals were regularly stationed to remind local governors where true power resided. They rarely interfered with civil rule, but they were always there, watching. A whisper of sedition could bring a squad of them to a governor's door. Rebellion in the provinces was often stopped before it even began, simply because the alternative facing the immortals was too dreadful to consider. Even within the royal court, their presence was multifunctional. They acted as ceremonial guards during Nowruz festivals, coronations, and diplomatic receptions. But behind the scenes, they monitored courtiers, sniffed out treason, and enforced the king's will with silent, deadly efficiency. Some historians argue that they acted almost like an internal intelligence agency, an ever-present warning that loyalty was not optional. This dual identity, warrior and envoy, enforcer and ornament, was part of their genius. Unlike most elite units of ancient times, who lived for the glory of battle alone, the immortals served a much broader imperial strategy. War was just one of their tools. Theirs was an empire held together not just by swords, but by symbols. The immortals understood that fear and awe are siblings. In foreign courts and remote palaces, their arrivals sent a clear and unmistakable message. The king is watching. The empire is eternal, and resistance is not worth the cost. And in this way, they often fought wars without ever unsheathing a blade. All empires age, and so do their legends. By the later years of the Achaemenid Empire, the immortals were still feared and respected, but they were no longer invincible. The machinery that had once made them seem truly immortal began to rust not, with a dramatic collapse, but with a slow, creeping inefficiency. As Persian kings grew increasingly detached from the battlefield, more concerned with courtly luxury and intrigue, the immortals too began to shift. They transformed from hardened warriors into royal ornaments. Under kings like Artaxerxes and Darius III, the elite guard still existed. They still dressed the part, and they still marched in perfect formation. But cracks had formed in the foundation. Recruitment. Standards slipped. Political favoritism began to seep into their ranks. Where once only the most disciplined and loyal men were selected, now nobles began pulling strings to place their unworthy sons into the sacred 10,000. The result was subtle, but fatal. It was uniformity without spirit, discipline without heart. This decay became tragically obvious when Alexander the Great launched his invasion of Persia in 334 BCE, at the decisive Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BCE. The immortals were deployed at the Persian center to defend King Darius III, and although they fought with courage, they could not hold their ground against the tactical brilliance and ruthless momentum of Alexander's Macedonian phalanx. They were outflanked, outmaneuvered, and ultimately overwhelmed. Worse yet, their myth didn't survive the battle. For centuries, the name Immortals had inspired awe. But Gaugamela proved they were no longer what they had been under Cyrus the Great or Xerxes I. The machinery of instant replacement faltered. The backup system that had once made their losses seem invisible simply wasn't in place anymore. The unit never recovered. When Alexander marched into Persepolis and took the royal palace, he walked into the shell of an empire. The Immortals weren't there to defend it. The unbroken line had finally been broken, but their story didn't end with defeat. Elements of the Immortals lived on. Alexander himself co-opted certain Persian traditions into his own army. Later, in the empire, a new elite force would rise, sometimes even called the Immortals again by historians, though they were not direct descendants. They echoed the original myth, 10,000 strong, elite, fearsome, and eternal. Even in their fall, the Immortals left behind a blueprint. They had shown the world how to build not just an army, but a legend. The Persian Immortals may have vanished from the battlefield, but their influence never truly disappeared. Long after the fall of the Achaemenid Empire, the idea of an unbreakable, elite fighting force remained lodged in the imagination of generals, kings, and storytellers alike. Their legend endured, not because they won every single battle, but because they represented something larger, the perfection of state-controlled power. An army that didn't age, didn't question, and didn't falter. When the Greeks described them, it was with a mixture of awe and suspicion. Herodotus called them immortals not because they could not be killed, but because they could not be seen to die. Their replacements were immediate, their presence eternal. To the Greeks, who were used to war as a chaotic, personal affair, this was eerie, almost unnatural. The Immortals were something else entirely, precise, faceless, and disciplined too. The very edge of humanity. In Roman times, scholars still referenced the Immortals when speaking of the great powers of antiquity. Even Byzantine historians noted the structure of the Persian elite guard as something to be admired. And in the early Islamic period, Arab historians recounted tales of the 10,000 who had once guarded the kings of old, their spears glinting like a forest of silver under the desert sun. The concept would be revived again in the Sasanian Empire, where an elite cavalry corps, sometimes referred to by historians as the New Immortals, served as the empire's armored fist. Though not directly descended from the Achaemenid unit, they carried the same mission, to embody imperial invincibility. Even Napoleon Bonaparte, centuries later, studied Persian military organization and praised their structure. Culturally, the Immortals have seeped into myth. Modern media often misrepresents them, turning them into monsters, demons, or masked assassins. But the truth was far more compelling. They were human, terrifyingly human. They were ordinary men turned into instruments of empire through relentless training, psychological control, and a deeply embedded system of continuity. They didn't need magic to become legendary, just consistency and silence. Their greatest weapon wasn't their sword. It was the idea that they were always coming, an eternal shadow on the horizon. And so, the Immortals live in stone carvings, in battle doctrines, and in the whispered fears of those who know that power, when well organized and endlessly replaced, can become something very close to immortality. Before there were legends of the Greek Amazons, there were the Scythians, nomadic warriors of the Eurasian steppe, who were feared and respected from the Black Sea to the Altai Mountains. And unlike most ancient societies, Scythian women didn't just stay behind in the tents, weaving cloths or raising children. They rode horses, they wielded bows, and they went to war. And they didn't just accompany the men into battle. They led them and fought with lethal skill. These were not exceptions to the rule. This was the culture. Greek historians like Herodotus were absolutely stunned when they encountered these women. He described entire tribes where women refused to marry unless they had first killed an enemy in combat. His words, which were originally intended as exotic curiosities, have since found stunning archaeological proof. Burial mounds, known as kurgans, scattered across modern-day Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and southern Russia, have yielded astonishing finds. The skeletons of young women buried with their bows, arrows, swords, and even battle-inflicted injuries. One such discovery revealed a woman with an arrowhead lodged in her spine, her body armored, her grave richly furnished. These weren't ceremonial weapons. They had been used, and so had she. Scythian society was fundamentally different from its settled contemporaries. Life on the steppe demanded mobility and resilience. Everyone, male or female, had to be able to ride, hunt, and defend the tribe. Girls learned archery as young as boys did. They wore the same practical leather trousers and the same armor. They even wore their hair and tattoos in similar fashions, making them almost indistinguishable on horseback in the middle of a storm of arrows. This created a warrior culture in which gender roles were fluid on the battlefield, but could still be stripped off of it. A Scythian woman could be a deadly force at a full gallop, and then return home to fulfill her ritual and maternal duties. The two roles were not in conflict. They were complementary. The Greek myths of the Amazons may have been inspired by exaggerated encounters with these real-life Scythian women. But while the Amazons of myth vanished into fantasy, the Scythians were very, very real. They fought the Persians, they clashed with the Greeks, and they terrified the Macedonians. And for centuries, they roamed the steppe with fire and fury. Men and women alike, in the small West African kingdom of Dahomey. In what is now modern-day Benin, an army of women once struck fear into the hearts of European colonizers, rival kingdoms, and anyone foolish enough to underestimate them. They were known as the Agagi, but the French nicknamed them the Dahomey Amazons, a comparison to the Greek myths. But these warriors were anything but mythical. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the Agagi had become the standing royal guard of Dahomey's king. But they weren't just guards. They were elite infantry, trained to kill, to defend, and to never, ever retreat. Initially, they may have started as a corps of elephant hunters or as palace attendants, but over time, they evolved into a formal, feared military force, recruited as young girls, often chosen for their strength or their spirit. The Agagi were separated from their families and placed into a life of intense training. Discipline was total. They ran obstacle courses filled with thorns. They sparred with real blades, and they swore oaths of celibacy and absolute loyalty to the king. Wore braided sashes and carried muskets, machetes, and clubs. But their deadliest weapon was psychological. European observers during the 19th century were shocked by their fearlessness and their brutality. One French officer noted with a sense of unease how a Dahomey Amazon rushed forward, ripped open a man's throat with her blade, and then calmly wiped it clean. These were not symbolic warriors. They were frontline shock troops, used in raids, battles, and ambushes. During the Franco-Dahomean Wars in the 1890s, the Agagi went toe-to-toe with French colonial troops. Outnumbered and outgunned, they still launched night raids, executed ambushes, and fought street by street to defend their kingdom. Their tenacity forced French commanders to reconsider not only their tactics, but also their deeply ingrained assumptions about gender in combat. But it wasn't just their battlefield success that mattered. The Dahomey Amazons existed in a deeply patriarchal world, and yet they carved out a space of total autonomy and influence. They advised kings, they performed ceremonial duties, and they shaped the kingdom's foreign policy not from behind the scenes, but with blades in hand. Though the French ultimately defeated Dahomey, the legend of the Agagi never died. In fact, their legacy helped to inspire modern fictional warriors like the Dora Milaje in Marvel's Black Panther. But the truth, as is so often the case, is far more impressive than fiction. In the shadowy pages of Japan's medieval history, one woman rides through blood and legend alike, Tomo Gozen, a samurai warrior of the late 12th century. She fought during the Genpei War, a brutal civil conflict between the Minamoto and Taira clans that ultimately gave birth to the first shogunate. Tomo wasn't a symbolic figure or a passive consort. She was a commander, a master swordswoman, and an archer, trained in the deadly arts of the battlefield and feared for her precision in combat. Her story emerges most famously from the hike Monogatari, or the Tale of the Hike, a sweeping war epic that masterfully blends history with poetic flair. In it, Tomo is described as especially beautiful, with white skin, long hair, and charming features. But the very next sentence drops. The real thunder. She was also a remarkably strong archer, and as a swordswoman, she was a warrior worth 1,000. For Tomo, beauty and lethality weren't contradictions. They were fused into one formidable being. Tomo served under Minamoto no Yoshinoka, a prominent warlord and her possible lover, during his campaign to seize control of Kyoto. She wasn't a camp follower or a battlefield nurse. She was in the thick of it, reportedly leading troops and even slaying multiple enemies in single combat. At the climactic Battle of Owazu in 1184, facing encirclement by rival Minamoto forces, Yoshinobu ordered his last, desperate stand. Rather than flee, Tomo chose to fight, in one of her most famous and visceral encounters. She is said to have galloped towards a charging enemy horseman, wrestled him from his saddle, pinned him to the ground, and beheaded him on the spot. She then calmly remounted her horse and continued into the chaos. That moment, whether embellished or entirely true, has endured for centuries as a symbol of her unmatched composure and skill. But what happened to Tomo after the war remains a mystery. Some accounts say she was captured and forced into marriage. Others say she became a nun, retreating into a life of silence. Still others believe she simply vanished, like a ghost, back into the mists of legend. Whatever the truth, the legacy of Tomo Gozen survived in theater, folklore, and the national memory of Japan. In a society built on rigid gender roles and strict patriarchal control, Tomo Gozen stood apart, blade drawn, head held high, and utterly unafraid. She wasn't just fighting for her lord. She was fighting for her right to exist in a world that told her she shouldn't. In the 1st century CE, the Roman Empire was at its absolute peak, disciplined, organized, and seemingly unstoppable. But then came Boudica, a flame-haired Celtic queen from Britannia who nearly brought the entire Roman machine to its knees. Her name would echo through history as a symbol of raw vengeance, national pride, and the terrifying force of a woman with nothing left to lose. Boudica was the wife of Prasutagus, king of the Iceni tribe in what is now eastern England. He was a client king under Rome, a puppet ruler who was allowed to maintain a semblance of power as long as he kept the peace. But when Prasutagus died, Rome ignored his will and moved to seize his lands and wealth outright. In the process, Roman officials had Boudica flogged publicly and, according to the historian Tacitus, raped her 2 daughters. It was a brutal, calculated humiliation designed to crush any thought of rebellion. Instead, it lit a wildfire in 60 or 61 CE. Boudica united several British tribes and launched one of the most ferocious revolts in Roman history. And she wasn't just a figurehead. Roman accounts describe her leading her army from a chariot, a spear in her hand, dressed in a flowing tunic with a massive gold torque around her neck. Her fiery red hair streamed behind her as she rode, calling her people to war. She was part priestess, part general, and all fury. Her forces descended on Camulodunum, modern Colchester, burning it to the ground. Next came Londinium, the seed of modern London, where she slaughtered Roman colonists and razed the city. Historians estimate that over 70,000 Romans and their sympathizers were killed in just a few months. Her army left a trail of ash and shattered arrogance behind them. But the Romans, under the command of Governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, eventually regrouped. Despite being vastly outnumbered, they lured Boudica into a pitched battle where Roman discipline and formation tactics proved decisive. The rebellion was brutally crushed. Boudica, facing defeat, is said to have taken poison rather than be captured. Though her uprising ultimately failed, Boudica's legacy only grew. Roman historians painted her as a barbarian, and yet one whose courage and leadership were impossible to ignore. For the British, especially in later centuries, she became an enduring symbol of resistance against tyranny, both foreign and domestic. In the war-ravaged steppes of Central Asia, during the golden age of Mongol expansion, there emerged a woman who terrified warriors and embarrassed Princess not with a sword, but with sheer, unadulterated physical dominance. Her name was Cutullune, and she was the great-great-granddaughter of none other than Genghis Khan himself. But she didn't just ride in his shadow. She carved out a legend of her own, one headlock at a time. Born around 1260 CE, Cutullune was the daughter of Kaidu Khan, a powerful cousin of Kublai Khan, and a rival claimant to the leadership of the Mongol Empire. Cutullune was raised like a warrior prince, trained in archery, horse riding, and battlefield tactics. But where she truly stood out was in her talent for wrestling, a deeply respected and highly competitive sport among the Mongols. According to the Persian historian Rashid al-Din, Cutullune vowed that she would only marry a man who could beat her in a wrestling match. Many tried, all of them failed. Dozens of suitors walked away defeated and humiliated, some even wagering horses, gold, or entire herds on their chances of winning. It's said that she amassed a personal fortune of 10,000 horses from her victories, turning her into not just a champion, but one of the wealthiest women on the steppe. But Cutullune wasn't just tossing men onto the dirt for fun. She fought alongside her father in real battles, commanding troops and breaking enemy lines. During campaigns against both rival Mongol factions and Chinese forces, Cutullune was Kaidu's most trusted military advisor. He even considered naming her as his successor, an unprecedented move in a culture completely dominated by male warlords. This, unsurprisingly, sparked a backlash. Some Mongol nobles whispered that her influence was unnatural, her power too threatening. In the end, Kaidu didn't make her his heir, choosing a male relative instead, but her reputation endured. Even Marco Polo, who traveled through the Mongol Empire, wrote of a Mongol princess who fought like a tiger and could ride and shoot as well as any man. Later, histories tried to romanticize or minimize her story, turning her into a love-struck figure, or reducing her incredible strength to mere legend. But make no mistake, Catullin was real, and her strength was legendary. She proved that in the heart of the most male-dominated empire on earth. A woman could still rise not because she was allowed to, but because no one could stop her in a time when women couldn't vote, own land freely, or even wear men's clothing without risking arrest. One French teenager not only wore armor, she led armies. Joan of Arc, born in 1412 in the tiny village of Domremy, was an illiterate peasant girl, but by the age of 17 she would command troops, confront kings, and bend the course of the 100 Years. War between France and England, her rise wasn't born from military training or noble lineage. Joan claimed it came from divine inspiration. She said she heard voices, those of saints like Michael, Catherine, and Margaret, who told her that she had been chosen by God to drive the English from France and to crown Charles, the Dauphin, as king. It was a wild, audacious claim, one that should have gotten her dismissed as mad. Instead, it got her an audience with the future King Charles VII. The court tested her. The clergy grilled her for weeks, but somehow she passed. They saw something in her conviction, a charisma, something unexplainable. And so, clad in white armor, her banner flying high, Joan was sent to Orleans, a besieged city that symbolized the war's turning point. The seasoned French commanders were skeptical, but Joan's mere presence revitalized their broken spirit. She didn't just stand on the sidelines. She led charges, she braved arrows, and she rallied troops under fire. Against all odds, the French lifted the siege. The victory electrified the entire nation. Joan became known as the Maid of Orleans, a symbol of divine favor and patriotic resistance. After a string of stunning victories, she escorted Charles to Reims, where he was crowned king, just as the voices had foretold. But power, fame, and miracles always come with enemies. In 1430, she was captured by Burgundian allies of the English. Tried by a pro-English ecclesiastical court, Joan was accused of heresy, witchcraft, and, notably, the crime of wearing male clothing. She was just 19 years old when they burned her alive in Rouen marketplace, but her death only magnified her. Legend, years later, the church reversed her conviction. Centuries later, she was canonized as a saint.